Welcome to the Explainer. History is rarely just a straight line. It's really more like a series of intense and honestly often explosive collisions of ideas. Over the centuries, the core ideals that actually shape how we're governed have been forged in the fires of rebellion and then tested by the terrifying prospect of total global destruction. Today, we're taking an absolutely incredible journey through time. We're going to explore how a highly localized colonial rebellion over on the eastern seaboard of North America evolved over 2 centuries into a massive global superpower. A superpower locked in a standoff capable of bringing about literal nuclear annihilation. So our story today spans all the way from a single musket volley to Winston Churchill's stark warning of a deeply divided world. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 6 key parts: the spark of rebellion, forging a new republic, the rise of the superpowers, the global ideological divide, proxy wars and paranoia, and finally, the end of an era. All right, let's dive right in. Part 1. The spark of rebellion. The 13 colonies push back. So, to really understand the superpower, we first have to understand the spark. Following the French and Indian War in the 1760s, the British crown was absolutely drowning in debt, and they looked to the 13 colonies to foot the bill. Now, keep in mind, the colonists had largely been governing themselves for years. It was this policy of kind of turning a blind eye known as salutary neglect. But when Parliament suddenly began imposing direct taxes, like the Stamp Act of 1765, well, tensions flared up fast. The colonists had already contributed troops, funds, and material to the war, yet they had zero direct representation in Parliament, and man, the escalation was rapid. Protests quickly led to the Boston Massacre in 1770, where British soldiers opened fire on a mob. Fast forward to 1773, and you've got colonists dumping 342 chests of taxed tea right into the harbor. Britain responded with these really harsh punitive laws. But actually, that backfired completely. It just unified the colonies and led directly to armed clashes at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. But, this wasn't just a fight over taxes. It was a fundamental disagreement on the very nature of governance itself. On one side, you have the British monarchy. They prioritized strict imperial control and deeply believed in inherited political power. On the flip side, you've got the emergent American patriots. They were rallying behind these massive Enlightenment concepts. Things like the consent of the governed, the right to representation, and universal natural rights. Part 2. Forging a new republic. Independence and victory. At this point, that ideological clash had well and truly crossed the point of no return. It transformed from a mere rebellion into a full-scale war for total sovereignty. In 1775, the Continental Congress formed an army and put George Washington in charge as commander-in-chief. By 1776, they formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. But honestly, the outcome of this war was highly uncertain. The true turning point, that came in 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga, where American forces decisively defeated the British. This victory was absolutely crucial. It proved to the world that the Americans could actually hold their own, which prompted France and later Spain to officially enter the conflict on the side of the colonists. Basically, it turned a civil war into an international one. The climax of that whole massive struggle finally arrived in the fall of 1781. Supported heavily by French warships and troops, Washington completely cornered the British Army under General Cornwallis at the Siege of Yorktown. Trapped and totally overpowered, Cornwallis surrendered. This devastating loss effectively broke King George III's control over the colonies and absolutely forced Britain to the negotiating table. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially recognized American sovereignty, but the ripple effects, they were monumental. The United States became the very first nation to establish a federal republic, complete with a written constitution based on the consent of the governed. By successfully challenging a massive empire and ending inherited monarchical rule, this revolution became the first of the so-called Atlantic revolutions. It directly inspired the French, Haitian, and Latin American movements. It literally marked a global transition, moving the world away from an age of monarchy and into a brand new age of freedom. Part 3. Rise of the Superpowers, the post-World War II landscape. All right, let's fast forward over 150 years. By 1945, those foundational American ideals were about to face an unprecedented global challenge. And the absolutely crucial thing to understand here is just how completely different the wartime experience was for the two emerging superpowers. The Soviet Union suffered a staggering 27 million casualties during World War II. Think about that number. Their infrastructure and agriculture were entirely devastated by a brutal invasion. Because of this massive national trauma, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin believed post-war security could only be achieved by installing a huge territorial buffer zone of pro-Soviet governments across Eastern Europe. In stark contrast, the United States suffered under 2% of those losses. The U.S. mainland was largely untouched, unemployment had dropped to a mere 2%, and the national GDP had nearly doubled during the war. So, coming out of the war, the United States sought a stable, revived global economy to prevent future wars and, importantly, deter the spread of communism. To make this happen, they introduced the Marshall Plan in 1948. We're talking $13 billion in financial aid to help rebuild Europe and promote free markets. Stalin, however, he saw this as a direct attempt to preserve capitalism and loosen his grip, so he explicitly forbade his eastern satellite states from accepting a single dime of that aid. Part 4. The Global Ideological Divide. Communism versus Capitalism. The world was now fundamentally divided by two heavily competing systems. On the American side, capitalism and democracy encouraged economic liberalization and individual liberties. While on the Soviet side, guided by Marxism, communism pushed for the common ownership of production. Their goal was to eliminate wealth extremes through a command economy, safeguarded by a one-party state that acted on behalf of the working class. This fierce ideological battle quickly spilled over into an intense rivalry for technological superiority, which gave us the famous space race. When the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 in October 1957, it caused absolute panic in the United States. But, it wasn't really just the little satellite they feared. It was the terrifying realization that the exact same rocket technology capable of reaching space could also be used to deliver nuclear warheads anywhere across the globe. The Soviets went on to achieve many scary firsts for the Americans, including sending the first animal, Laika, and the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit, before the U.S. famously landed Apollo 11 on the moon in July of 1969. Part 5. Proxy Wars and Paranoia. The Cold War turns hot. Now, while Europe had kind of settled into this tense, frozen stalemate, the Cold War turned incredibly hot in developing nations. The primary American strategy driving these interventions was known as containment. The whole idea was that if Soviet expansion could just be contained, the communist system's own inherent internal flaws would eventually cause it to collapse on its own. This policy paired up with the domino theory, which was this deep fear that if one nation fell to communism, its neighbors would inevitably follow. Well, that justified massive and often tragic military interventions, most notably the grueling wars in Korea and Vietnam. But there was also a deeply covert, shadowy side to this global chess match. The newly formed CIA heavily utilized what they called plausible deniability to carry out operations abroad without official government involvement. They actively intervened in foreign governments to protect American interests and prevent Soviet influence from taking root. This included orchestrating coups against leaders in Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954, who had attempted to nationalize foreign-owned industries. They even supported the deposition of leaders like Patrice Lumumba in the Congo in 1961. And looming over all of these proxy wars was the absolutely terrifying reality of nuclear weapons. Following the incredibly tense Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, where, let's be real, the world came closer to total nuclear war than ever before, a chilling new military doctrine emerged. It was called Mutually Assured Destruction, or MAD for short. Planners realized that if both sides specifically targeted population centers, like major cities, instead of military bases, the ironclad guarantee of total societal annihilation would theoretically prevent any rational leader from ever pushing the button. Part 6. The End of an Era. The Fall of the Soviet Union. Decades of massive defense spending and exhausting proxy battles ultimately took a profound toll. By the 1970s and 80s, the Soviet economy was seriously failing to innovate during what's known as the era of stagnation under Leonid Brezhnev. So, when Mikhail Gorbachev eventually took power, he attempted to save the system through economic restructuring, known as perestroika, and a new policy of openness called glasnost. However, these reforms actually kind of backfired. They paved the way for widespread vocal criticism of the state. Realizing the Soviet military would no longer step in to crush uprisings, a massive wave of democratic revolutions swept across Eastern Europe in 1989. This directly led to the iconic tearing down of the Berlin Wall. Finally, facing complete internal political collapse and total economic exhaustion from the decades-long arms race, Gorbachev resigned in 1991, and the Soviet Union dissolved into 15 independent states. Wow. We have covered a staggering amount of ground today, from colonial patriots fighting for the simple right to govern themselves, all the way to modern superpowers navigating a chilling doctrine of mutually assured destruction. These immense ideological battles have fundamentally shaped the modern world we live in today. And it leaves us with a really profound question. From throwing tea into Boston Harbor to holding the power of global nuclear annihilation, how will history ultimately judge the ongoing legacy of these events? What really is the true cost of securing freedom, and how do we protect those ideals in the future? Thank you so much for exploring these massive historical shifts with me. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.